Chapter 1. A Town Divided. Monroe, Mississippi, the town where racial lines are drawn with invisible ink, yet their presence dictates every aspect of life. The town, steeped in old traditions and segregationist ideologies, thrives on a system that keeps its black residents under constant scrutiny, while the white elite wield unchallenged power. The streets hum with whispers. The shops and churches act as battlegrounds of silent tension, and the justice system operates as little more than an arm of oppression. Among those living in this divided world is Isaiah Johnson, a 22-year-old black man with skilled hands and an unyielding spirit. A carpenter by trade, Isaiah spends his days shaping wood into furniture and repairing homes that he can build but never own, homes that belong to those who look at him and see not a man but a second-class citizen. He lives in the Black District of Monroe with his mother and younger siblings, carrying the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Despite his cautious nature, Isaiah knows that eyes follow him wherever he goes. The white townspeople watch him with suspicion, not because he has done anything wrong, but because his very existence in a world built to suppress him is enough to be considered a threat. He has never crossed any lines, never spoken out, never questioned the status quo. But in Monroe, none of that matters. The mere fact that he is black in a town that thrives on racial hierarchy means he is always one misstep away from trouble. The tension in Monroe is thick, an unseen force, pressing against the black community like a storm waiting to break. Rumors spread easily, accusations fly with little evidence, and justice is a tool used to instill fear rather than uphold fairness. For Isaiah and others like him, the town is a game of survival, one where the rules are rigged against them from birth. Isaiah spent his life trying to stay clear of danger, trying to be invisible in a world that doesn't want him, but deep down he knows the truth. One accusation, one misunderstanding, one lie could change everything. Chapter 2. The Accusation. On a humid summer evening, Carolyn Wallace, the daughter of a wealthy white businessman, is found unconscious behind Monroe's general store. Her dress is torn, her hands scraped, and a bruise forming on her temple. The town is immediately thrown into chaos. The sheriff, James Colton, arrives at the scene within minutes. Caroline is barely awake, her words slurred, her memory foggy. She cannot recall what happened, cannot name a suspect, but in Monroe, that doesn't matter. The whispers begin before the facts are even clear. A store clerk remembers seeing Isaiah Johnson walking by the general store earlier that evening. Another man swears he saw him in the alley, though he gives no details. Speculation spreads like wildfire, twisting into certainty in the minds of those looking for someone to blame. Isaiah, exhausted from a long day's work, is at home with his family when the sheriff and his deputy storm inside. He doesn't have time to ask questions before they seize him, shackles thrown around his wrists. His mother screams, demanding to know what her son is being accused of, but she receives no answer. "What did I do?" Isaiah gasps as they drag him from his home. The sheriff spits at his feet. "You know exactly what you did, boy." And just like that, Isaiah Johnson's fate is sealed before he even steps into a jail cell. Chapter 3. The Mockery of Justice. Isaiah's trial is set within days of his arrest, a rush to convict rather than investigate. The courtroom is a spectacle before proceedings even begin. White townspeople gather outside, eager for a show, while black residents watch in tense silence, knowing the outcome is already decided. The judge, a staunch segregationist, barely acknowledges Isaiah when he enters. The prosecutor, District Attorney Franklin Marsh, wastes no time painting Isaiah as a violent criminal, despite having no solid evidence. The prosecution's case is built on hearsay and racial fear-mongering. The store clerk, who claimed to have seen Isaiah near the general store earlier that evening, testifies, though under questioning, his details are inconsistent. Another white witness swears Isaiah fit the description, despite admitting he never got a good look at the alleged attacker. No physical evidence ties Isaiah to the crime, yet the jury remains unmoved. The entire trial is a performance meant not to uncover the truth, but to justify what the town has already decided. Isaiah's defense attorney, a disinterested white man named Richard Keller, makes a half-hearted attempt to object but quickly gives up. He cross-examines no one, offers no counter-arguments, and refuses to challenge the sheriff's questionable methods of investigation. When Isaiah, desperate, asks what their defense strategy is, Keller sighs and mutters, "Just keep quiet and pray." The jury, 12 white men, barely deliberate, they glance at each other, nodding knowingly, and return with a guilty verdict in less than 10 minutes. The judge, emotionless, bangs the gavel. Isaiah barely has time to react before the sentence is announced: death by hanging. His mother screams, collapsing in anguish, but no one listens. Isaiah never had a chance. The trial was a performance meant to uphold the town's racial order rather than deliver justice. His conviction is not about guilt or innocence, it is about power. And in Monroe, Mississippi, the law has never been designed to protect men like Isaiah. Chapter 4, A Mother's Plea. As Isaiah sits in a dark, cramped jail cell, his mother, Sarah Johnson, refuses to accept the injustice that has swallowed her son. A woman of quiet strength, Sarah has spent her life enduring the silent oppression of Monroe, watching as countless black men were taken away, never to return. But now it is her son, her baby boy, and she cannot remain silent. She spends her days knocking on doors, pleading for help from anyone who will listen. She writes letters to newspapers, appeals to church leaders, and even sends messages to civil rights organizations outside of Mississippi. She begs not just for Isaiah, but for the truth to be heard. But Monroe's white leaders turn their backs on her, dismissing her as a desperate woman clinging to false hope. When she approaches the town's white ministers, they shake their heads solemnly. "We'll pray for you, Mrs. Johnson," they say, but their hands remain folded in inaction. Faith, it seems, is conditional in Monroe. But within the black community, Sarah finds strength. Neighbors gather in whispered meetings, pastors invoke Isaiah's name in their sermons, and local activists begin raising their voices. The injustice is clear to them. They have seen it before, lived it, and lost too many to it. But fear is a powerful weapon, and Monroe has wielded it for generations. Sarah's cries echo through the town, but the walls are thick with indifference. Each night she kneels by her bedside, gripping Isaiah's childhood Bible, whispering prayers into the darkness. She prays not just for her son's life, but for the courage to keep fighting. She knows time is running out, but a mother's love does not yield to fear. Chapter 5, A Friend's Betrayal. David Carter sits alone in his father's parlor, the weight of his silence pressing against his chest like a millstone. He knows the truth. He has always known it. Isaiah Johnson, his childhood friend, is innocent. The boy he once spent summers fishing with, the one who helped him build forts in the woods, would never have harmed anyone. But now, as Isaiah faces death, David finds himself trapped between morality and the unrelenting pressure of the town. His father, Samuel Carter, a wealthy landowner and respected businessman, has made his stance clear. You're not going to ruin this family's name over some nonsense, David. You keep your mouth shut, you understand me? Samuel's voice is firm, carrying the unmistakable warning of a man who does not tolerate disobedience. David has seen what happens to those who step out of line. He has seen the way white men who speak against their own are cast out, their businesses boycotted, their families shunned. His father's threats are not just words, they are promises. Yet, in the pit of his stomach, he knows that staying silent is as much a betrayal as pulling the noose tight himself. The night before the sentencing, David walks to the jailhouse under the cover of darkness. The streets are deserted, save for the occasional flickering lantern. He stops in front of the cell, gripping the cold iron bars. Isaiah sits on the cot, his face shadowed in the dim candlelight. David, Isaiah's voice is steady, but there is something behind it. Not anger, not even sadness, but disappointment. David swallows hard. I wanted to see you. I wanted to tell you that you're sorry. Isaiah's voice is quiet, yet it cuts deeper than any blade. Or that you're too afraid to stand up for what's right. David looks away. He wants to say something, anything, but the words lodge in his throat. Isaiah exhaled, shaking his head. I always knew there'd come a time when this town would turn on me. I just didn't think you'd be one of them. David's hands tremble as he grips the bars tighter. The weight of his cowardice is unbearable, but the cost of courage feels even heavier. When the trial resumes the next morning, the judge asks if anyone has any testimony that might aid in Isaiah's defense. David is in the courtroom. His throat tightens. His heartbeat thunders in his ears. This is his moment. This is his chance. He stands, then hesitates. His father's gaze bores into him, a silent warning. The entire town waits, eyes fixed on him. The air is suffocating. David exhales and slowly sits back down. Isaiah's fate is sealed not just by the lies of others, but by the silence of a friend who lacked the courage to do what was right. And that, David realizes too late, is the deepest betrayal of all. Chapter 6. The Verdict. The courthouse is packed, the air thick with unspoken conclusions. The townspeople sit in tense anticipation, their minds already made up long before the jury enters. Isaiah stands in the center of it all, his hands shackled, his posture straight. He knows what's coming. The judge enters, his robes pristine, his face devoid of emotion. He does not see Isaiah as a man, but as a name on a case that must be closed. The jury, 12 white men who have never seen Isaiah as their equal, return to their seats. They deliberate for less than 10 minutes. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asks. The foreman, a middle-aged man with a rigid stance, stands. We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Isaiah Johnson, guilty. A gasp ripples through the black section of the courtroom. Sarah Johnson lets out a cry, clutching her chest, her body shaking. But no one on the other side of the courtroom reacts. To them, This was always the only outcome. Zaiv's breathing remained steady, his fists clenched behind his back. He wants to speak, to declare his innocence, to tell them that they are all wrong, but he knows it does not matter. The judge's gavel slams down. The accused will be sentenced to death by hanging. Sarah collapses, her cries echoing through the courtroom. The black community sits frozen, their grief trapped beneath the weight of fear. They have seen this happen before. They know it will happen again. Aistai is dragged from the courtroom as murmurs of approval rise among the white townsfolk. Some shake hands, others tip their hats in silent satisfaction. Justice has been served, they believe. But justice has not been served. An innocent man has been condemned, and the world will move on as if his life never mattered. Chapter 7. The Lynching. The sun has barely set when the mob begins to gather outside the jailhouse. The air is thick with the smell of sweat and torch smoke, voices rising in an angry chorus demanding blood. The sheriff and his deputies stand by the entrance, not to stop the crowd, but to let them through. In Monroe, justice is not handed down in courtrooms. It is carried out in the streets, beneath the branches of an old oak tree. Inside the cell, Josiah Johnson stands, hands gripping the cold iron bars. He hears the crowd, feels their rage pulsing through the air. He has known this moment was coming since the moment of his arrest. Fear churns in his gut, but he refuses to beg. The door bursts open, and hands, too many hands, seize him, yanking him forward. His mother's screams pierce the night, but they are drowned out by the roars of the crowd. Isaiah stumbles, his feet barely able to keep up as they drag him into the streets. They parade him through the town, past the courthouse where his so-called trial took place, past the stores where he once shopped, past the homes of people who once greeted him with nods. Now those same people watch in silence, their windows dark, their doors locked. The oak tree looms ahead, its branches stretching wide like arms eager to embrace him. A noose swings from one of its limbs, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Isaiah breathes deeply, swallowing his terror. A man steps forward, a rope in his hands. The sheriff watches, cigar in his mouth, indifferent. "Say your piece, boy," someone sneers. Zara lifts his chin, his voice is steady, his eyes burning with defiance. "I didn't do it." The mob erupts in laughter, in jeers and curses. The rope tightens around his neck. Isaiah's last breath is a prayer, one not for himself, but for those he is leaving behind. The world goes dark. Chapter 8. The town moves on. The morning after the lynching, Monroe awakens as if nothing has happened. The sun rises over the courthouse, the same as it always has, casting golden light over the cobblestone streets, where Isaiah Johnson took his last steps. The scent of freshly baked bread wafts from the bakery. Children laugh on their way to school, and shopkeepers flip their "open" signs with practiced ease. The newspapers do not report a murder. Instead, they call it "justice served," a criminal put to death before he could do any more harm. No one questions it. The sheriff, sitting comfortably in his office, smokes a cigar while reviewing paperwork for the next town event, satisfied that order has been maintained. There is no investigation, no arrests, no remorse. In the Black District, the mood is different. Curtains remain drawn, doors stay locked, and conversations are held in hushed tones. Everyone saw what happened, but no one dares speak of it aloud. To challenge Monroe's version of events is to risk meeting the same fate. Isaiah's mother, Sarah, refuses to leave her home, Her wails echo through the night, a mother grieving for a son she could not save. Her neighbors try to comfort her, but what is there to say? No words can bring back the dead. Days turn to weeks, and the town continues on, burying Isaiah's story under layers of silence and willful forgetting, but some memories refuse to be erased. Beneath the old oak tree, where Isaiah took his final breath, the ground is still stained, and though Monroe pretends not to see it, the truth lingers in the air, refusing to be silenced. Chapter 9. A Whisper of Truth. Chapter 10. A Mother's Grief, a Legacy Remembered. Isaiah's mother, Sarah Johnson, never stops speaking his name. Even as the world moves on, she clings to his memory, refusing to let Monroe erase what happened. The pain does not fade, nor does her rage, but it fuels her. She tells his story to anyone who will listen, ensuring that his name is not forgotten. Each morning she walks past the old oak tree, her eyes lingering on the spot where her son took his last breath. The town pretends it never happened, but the stain of that night lingers, imprinted in the soil, in the bark, in the silence of those who choose to forget. She fights, she writes letters, appeals to journalists, pleads for someone to care. But Monroe is a place that does not welcome justice for the likes of Isaiah Johnson. The sheriff remains in office. The men responsible for her son's death live their lives untouched, their consciences unburdened. Years pass, and Sarah grows older, but she refuses to let go. And then, finally, something changes. A historian, a young black woman named Camille Evans, arrives in Monroe, researching the town's buried history. She listens to Sarah's story, documenting every word, determined to tell the truth that Monroe tried to bury. For the first time in decades, Isaiah's name is spoken beyond whispers. A plaque is placed beneath the oak tree, a small memorial to Isaiah Johnson. It is not enough, not nearly enough, but it is something, and Sarah knows that as long as his name is spoken, as long as the truth is remembered, Isaiah has not truly been erased. Chapter 11. Buried Secrets, Unspoken Fears. Years after Isaiah's death, Monroe remains unchanged on the surface. The white families continue their lives as though nothing happened, while the black community carries the weight of history in their bones. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of resurfacing. One evening, an old man named Thomas Grayson, a former deputy, sits alone in his home, nursing a glass of whiskey. His hands shake as he flips through an old leather-bound journal. Inside are names, dates, and details that could dismantle the town's carefully constructed version of Isaiah's story. He was there that night. He knows Isaiah was innocent. He knows the truth. For decades, he kept silent, just as the town expected him to. But as he nears the end of his life, guilt festers inside him like an open wound. He cannot take these secrets to the grave. Meanwhile, Camille Evans, the young historian documenting Monroe's buried history, uncovers something startling. In the archives of an old church, she finds a letter, one written by an anonymous townsperson decades ago, confessing the real events of that night. The letter names names. It describes Isaiah's last moments. It is a piece of the truth that Monroe tried to erase. Camille begins to piece together a timeline, uncovering more than just Isaiah's story. She finds evidence of a pattern, names of other black men and women who disappeared, who were accused, who were never given justice. Monroe's dark past is deeper than anyone realized. But the town is watching. Some people are willing to do anything to keep the past buried. As Camille pushes forward, whispers begin, threats, warnings to leave well enough alone, but she refuses. The truth is too important. In the dead of night, she receives an unexpected visitor, Thomas Grayson, clutching his journal, his eyes weary. "I have something to tell you," he says, "and I don't have much time." The buried secrets of Monroe are beginning to rise, and the town's carefully kept silence is about to be shattered. Chapter 12. The Awakening of Conscience. The truth once buried begins to rise. Camille Evans sits at her desk, the weight of Monroe's dark history pressing down on her as she sorts through the records she has collected. The names on the pages, the dates, the stories, they all point to a history of systematic terror. Isaiah Johnson's lynching was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern, a town that thrived on silence and complicity, that built its peace on the suffering of those it deemed unworthy. Across town, Thomas Grayson wrestles with his conscience. His decision to speak has left him a marked man. There have been phone calls, anonymous voices warning him to let the past be. There are eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to falter. But he has carried this burden for too long. The nightmares haunt him, the screams he ignored decades ago still echoing in his ears. Thomas visits Camille in secret, handing over his journal. "This is the truth, the real story," he says. His hands tremble, but his voice is steady. "I should have spoken up then. I won't die a coward." Within the journal's pages lies damning evidence. Proof that the sheriff's office orchestrated the cover-up, that key witnesses were coerced, that the town's most powerful men ensured Isaiah's execution without a fair trial. Camille reads, her pulse racing. This is what she has been searching for. Word spreads quickly. The black residents of Monroe, long silenced by fear, begin to talk. Stories emerge of grandfathers lost, of families broken, of children growing up knowing that justice does not belong to them. The town's fragile peace begins to crack. The truth is no longer a whisper. It is a movement. But Monroe is not ready to reckon with its past. The resistance comes swiftly. Threats appear scrawled on Camille's car. Thomas's house is vandalized. The sheriff's office issues a public statement, dismissing the claims as misguided attempts to stir unrest. Yet the tide is turned. For the first time in generations, Monroe's past is being spoken aloud, and the truth, unstoppable, undeniable, is demanding to be heard. Chapter 13. A Community Remembers. For decades, Monroe buried the memory of Isaiah Johnson, locking his story away in whispered conversations and hidden guilt. But as Camille Evans' research spreads, the truth begins to take root in the hearts of the town's black residents. What was once whispered is now spoken aloud, and the name Isaiah Johnson refuses to be forgotten. The elders gather in church basements, recounting the stories their parents told them, stories of injustice that stretch back generations. Young activists in the community take up the cause, organizing meetings, collecting testimonies, and demanding recognition. The community, once silenced by fear, begins to find its voice. At first, Monroe resists. The town's leaders scoff at the notion of revisiting old wounds, dismissing the efforts as troublemaking. But the tide is shifting. National journalists start to take notice. Civil rights groups amplify the cause. The eyes of the outside world begin to turn toward Monroe. Then one day a simple but profound act takes place. A group of local black families gather beneath the old oak tree where Isaiah was lynched. They bring candles, photographs, and stories. They say his name, they pray, they grieve. What started as a small vigil grows into something bigger. The younger generations who once felt powerless against Monroe's history realize that change does not come all at once. It comes from remembering, from refusing to let the past be erased. For the first time, Isaiah's story belongs not to the town that betrayed him, but to the people who loved him. And Monroe, no longer able to turn away, is forced to listen. Chapter 14. The Search for Redemption. The tides of history cannot be reversed, but they can be reckoned with. As Monroe begins to feel the weight of its past, a movement grows from within, driven by those who refuse to let Isaiah's story end in silence. Camille Evans, Thomas Grayson, and the families who suffered in the shadows of injustice push forward, demanding accountability for the sins of the town. The resistance remains fierce. Monroe's leaders do everything they can to discredit Camille's findings, labeling her research as divisive and dangerous. The local newspaper refuses to print her articles. The sheriff's office dismisses the calls for justice, and threats continue to mount. But the truth is no longer hidden. As national reporters descend upon Monroe, Isaiah's name spreads beyond the town's borders, forcing a reckoning that can no longer be ignored. Civil rights lawyers take interest in the case, launching an official inquiry into the circumstances of Isaiah's trial and execution. Amidst the growing pressure, the town's mayor, under scrutiny, orders a historical commission to investigate past racial violence in Monroe. It is the first time the town acknowledges what so many already knew, that Isaiah Johnson was never given justice. A town hall is held, the first of its kind, where survivors and families of victims share their stories. Sarah Johnson, now frail but unbroken, takes the stand. Her voice shakes, but her words are clear. "You took my son from me, but you cannot take the truth." The meeting ignites anger and guilt in equal measure. Some white residents storm out in defiance, unwilling to face the sins of their ancestors. Others, however, listen, some for the first time, realizing that their silence had been part of the crime. A campaign begins to have Isaiah's conviction posthumously overturned, an effort that faces many hurdles but refuses to be dismissed. The truth, once whispered, has now become a demand. Redemption is not a single moment. It is a fight, one that Monroe can no longer run from. And for the first time in history, the town begins to ask itself the question it has avoided for generations: how do you make amends for the lives you stole? Chapter 15. The fight for justice lives on. The struggle for justice does not end with the acknowledgement of past wrongs. It is a battle that continues long after the headlines fade. The town of Monroe, once silent, now faces a growing movement demanding true accountability. Camille Evans and a coalition of activists refuse to let Isaiah's story be a footnote in history. They petition the courts to officially overturn his conviction, citing the fabricated evidence, coerced testimony, and racist judicial practices that led to his wrongful execution. Legal teams from national organizations take an interest, filing motions that challenge Monroe's justice system itself. Sarah Johnson, now frail but resolute, stands before the press, holding her son's photograph. "I have waited a lifetime for justice. she says, her voice unwavering, and I will not stop now. The town remains divided. Some argue that digging up the past will only stir more resentment, while others, especially the younger generation, embrace the truth and demand change. For the first time, Monroe holds open forums where both black and white residents confront the reality of their town's history. Months later, the Mississippi State Court announces a posthumous exoneration of Isaiah Johnson. The decision, though symbolic, marks a turning point. His name is cleared, but the fight for justice continues. The demand for reparations, education reform, and acknowledgement of systemic injustices gains traction. A memorial is built at the site of the lynching, bearing Isaiah's name alongside those of others who suffered similar fates. Never again, the plaque reads, "May the truth live where silence once reigned." And so, the fight for justice does not end, it transforms. Isaiah Johnson's story, once buried, now fuels a movement that refuses to be forgotten.